Whether Jews may enter Har Habayis largely depends on whether we know where the Beis Hamikdash stood. A common assumption is that we don't know for sure, but that assumption has a history. In this class, we trace the history of this uncertainty, primarily through the accounts of Jewish travelers who visited Eretz Yisrael and recorded what they saw and heard. This is the third installment in a series about going up onto Har Habayis. The month of Elul, Tavshin Chav Zayin, the summer of 1967, not too long after the Six-Day War, there was a proclamation that was published all over in Eretz Yisrael in different publications, in different newspapers, and different journals, under the title of Hoida'ah V'Azhara, a notice and a warning. And this was a notice and a warning that was signed by many Rabbanim. I'll briefly mention some of the names, not all of them, just some of the names. The Ashkenazic chief rabbi, Rabbi Unterman; the Sephardic chief rabbi, Rabbi Nisim; Rabbi Al-Yashiv; Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach; Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg; Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin; Rabbi Avadia Yosef; Rabbi Yanko Landau from Bnei Brak; Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook. Nice range of rabbis here who are all signed, and again there were many more, who are all signed on this proclamation. What does the proclamation say? Acharei shezochinu b'chasdei Hashem Yisbarech, we've merited with Hashem's kindness, Har Habayis v'Hamikdash, that the holy mountain, the mountain that houses the Beis Hamikdash, Chemdas Yisrael, the glory of the Jewish people, Nimtza b'Rishusenu, it is now in our hands, as those famous words, Har Habayis b'Yodeinu. The Rabbi Mahamoim Beis Yisrael, and many Jews, Noyarim, are pouring forth, Lachsos ayin ba'ayin, to come look and see Mekoim HaKodesh VaHaMikdash, to come and see the Beis Hamikdash. So most people are just coming, and they're coming to the area around, and the Koisel HaMaravi, and those surrounding areas. However, and that's great. However, v'yesh mehem, there are some people who are arriving, shenichnasim b'shatach Har Habayis, who are going on to the Har Habayis. And that's a problem. Why is that a problem? So let's hear what they have to say. Asher midoirei doiros anu muzharim v'nimnoim mileikanes b'chol shatach Har Habayis kulei. For many generations, not specified exactly how many, but for many generations, we are forbidden and we refrain from going onto the entire Har Habayis. Why is that? Why is it that we refrain and we're forbidden from going on to Har Habayis? So they say two things. Number one, pen nikasho chas v'shalom be'isur chomor, maybe we will stumble on the serious prohibition b'pkiya b'taras hamokem hakadosh hazeh, doing something offensive at this holy site. They don't exactly explain what they mean by that, but we can speculate that what they mean over here is that there's a whole range of things that go under the mitzvah of Moira Mikdash, of how a person has to behave when they're in the vicinity of the Beis Hamikdash. And the Rambam writes about this in Hilchas Beis Abchira Perek Zayin. He writes over there that when a person goes on Har Habayis, you're not allowed to go with a stick, and you're not allowed to go with leather shoes, and you're not allowed to spit. And so there's a whole range of things that we're not allowed to do. And if a person goes, and that's a serious violation of a lav of Moira Mikdash or an asay. So that is possibly one, that is l'chayra what they mean. They may also be referring to here the issue of Tumah Yotzei Megufay. So we spoke about this in the previous classes where we touched on the issue of the Har Habayis. Someone who has Tumah Yotzei Megufay, and that is a Zav, a Nida, those types of Tumah, is not allowed to go onto Har Habayis without going through the process of Tara, which is conceivably possible to go to the mikveh, and to do it is necessary to purify oneself. But what if people don't do so? And so this is the first reason why they say we shouldn't be going there. Again, they don't specify, but that's what they mean. But the second point they do specify. Zois va'oid. Moreover, the rabbis hayamim, due to the long time of our galus, Nelam me'itanu hamakom hameduyek shel Hamikdash. We have forgotten the exact location of the Beis Hamikdash. Oh, that's a whole other problem. Why? Because chalanichnas al shatach Har Habayis, anyone who goes to the Har Habayis, alul hikanes mebli yodim al makam hamikdash v'kodesh hakadoshim. Because we don't know where it is, anywhere you go, you may end up going into the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. You may end up going into the place of the Beis Hamikdash. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is now, when they're talking about karas over here, he's referring to specifically the prohibition of a tmei mace to go into the areas in the Beis Hamikdash where a tmei mace is not allowed to go. Tmei mace is allowed to go onto Har Habayis. Tmei mace is not allowed to go into certain areas of the Beis Hamikdash, Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Heichel, some areas of Hazara, is forbidden. We don't want to get into the details of where exactly that line is there, and nor did they here. Their point is that because we don't know, so therefore anywhere you go is a possibility of messing up in this area. Because remember, we saw in a previous class, I don't want to go back there, but just bekitzer, that the Rambam holds that the same Kedusha that was there from Zman Habayis is there today. And so the same way there was Isser Karas B'Zman Habayis is there today. The Raiva disagreed, and he held there's no Karas B'Zman Habayis. Okay, fine, but we're not going to follow the Raiva. We're going to follow the Rambam. And if you recall, we did a story about Montefiore. And Montefiore's teacher and his mashpia, his secretary, descended and said, we're following the Raiva. So what did the Rabbanim in Yerushalayim tell him? You're following the Raiva. You can't follow the Raiva. Following the Rambam. The Magen Avraham passes like the Rambam. Okay, we're not going back to that sugya, but it makes a lot of sense that the Rabbanim would follow this position. Lefichach, therefore, anu chayzrim u'matzirim, we're reissuing this prohibition. Amashi uzhanu mikvar, but this is not. They want you to know we're not doing anything new here in 1967. Huzharnu mikvar. This is a pre-existing prohibition. We didn't make anything up. This has been our assumption for as far back as anyone can remember. But we're here to reaffirm it. Shabal yoin ish v'isha leikones v'chol shatach Har Habayis. No one go on to the shatach Har Habayis. This is the psak din and the hoidah and azhara that's given out in Elul of Tavshin Chaf Zayin. Now, this idea that we don't know where the Beis Hamikdash is not a new idea. We saw that in the previous class that we did, where they were discussing that when the Rambam went, so we had Rabbi Yosef Yedid, who was the rabbi from the Bukharians. If you recall, toward the end, he's like, okay, the Rambam knew, but we don't know where the Beis Hamikdash is. He was writing this in the late 1920s and the early 1930s, when this same issue was being discussed then, during the British mandatory period, where it was conceivably possible for maybe Jews to go up to Har Habayis. So there was Rabbanim who wanted to say that we should, and Rabbi Yosef Yedid said we shouldn't. We don't know where Har Habayis is. So we don't know where Makam HaMikdash is. So the argument they're saying here in 1967, we don't know what Makam HaMikdash is, not a new argument. It was said decades prior. And now let me tell you what we want to do here today. What we want to do over here is we want to go back in time, and we want to try to trace when did this forgetting happen. In other words, who are the first people who said, we don't know where the Beis HaMikdash is? When did that happen? So that's question number one. Related question is, who are the first people who said, Har Habayis, forget it, off limits, let's not start figuring it out, we're not going up to Har Habayis. When did that happen? And finally, assuming that the Rambam went up onto Har Habayis and davened there, which I think is the correct approach as we discussed in the last class on this subject. So the question is, how did the Rambam know where to go and not to go? What information did the Rambam have that he was going by? So these are some questions we can hopefully gain some clarity about as we move through some of the sources today. Tzad HaShava, many of the sources we're going to look at today, is travelers and people who came to Eretz Yisrael, and they're writing about what they're seeing, and so they're discussing what they're seeing. Not all of the sources, but a nice number of them are going to be from that category. And they're often not easy to read because there's a lot of information packed into them that on the one hand is interesting, but on the other hand is like, what? What does that mean? That raises types of questions. What's the historical accuracy about all these different details? And we can really get lost. So we'll try to keep a balance of remaining on the core point, but at the same time, if there is some interesting information along the way, So then we'll encounter that as well. Okay, so our first source that we're going to look at today comes from the Cairo Gniza. Because it makes so much sense. This is where this type of discussion deserves a little Cairo Gniza, so why not some Cairo Gniza? In 1939, someone published, his name was Professor Asaf, he published a one-page document from the Cairo Gniza. As far as I know, it was never discovered or determined what was the page before it, what was the page after it. Is it a letter? Is it part of a chibur? Is it part of a work? Who wrote it? When was it written? No one knows. But what you could tell from that one page is that the handwriting and the paper, the way they're able to guesstimate these types of things, they think the 1000s, the 1100s, something like that in terms of this paper. What's going on this one paper? On this one paper, it's talking about the Arab conquest of Eretz Yisrael that happened in the 7th century, in the 630s, in the decade of the 630s is when the Arabs came, and they took Eretz Yisrael from the hands of the Byzantines. The Byzantines were the Eastern Roman Empire. The Romans conquered Eretz Yisrael, and then when the Roman Empire split in two, Eretz Yisrael remained in the possession of the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which was known as the Byzantine Empire. So really, if you want to just count the Byzantine period as part of the Roman period, if you want to do that, all the way up into the 630s. In the 630s, that's when Islam was born, and it spread very, very quickly. And sometime toward the end of that decade is when they came and they took control of Eretz Yisrael and took Yerushalayim from the hands of the Byzantines. This document over here, this one page, is saying a story written in Judeo-Arabic. So it's written by Yidden, saying a story about what happened then. So it says as follows. It says, Oz Tziva Oisam, then he, talking about a certain person, commanded them, Litata Mokim HaMikdash to sweep up and to clean and to remove the debris from the Beis Hamikdash. The implication of this story is that during the Byzantine period, the Har Habayis was a tail, was a destroyed place where there's just rock and debris and a whole bunch of destroyed things that were there. And the argument being made over here is that it was not the case like that. The Byzantines came and said, oh, let's build something here, or let's make something, or anything like that. That's the assumption of the story over here, which is why when the Arab conquest happens and they come and they're taking control of Har Habayis, they're going to change the policy. They're cleaning up. Now, who's this person who he's talking about? It clarifies right away. So Umar was overseeing the project. So this was not something Umar gave to his delegates to do. He himself is doing it. Who's Umar? Umar is the caliph. What's a caliph? A caliph, think about the Hebrew or Aramaic word lachalof, to change. So caliph in Arabic is the same word, khalif. Khalif means to change. In other words, it's the Mamal HaMakom. So you had Muhammad, and then you had the first caliph, his first Mamal HaMakom, and then the second caliph is the second Mamal HaMakom. So Umar is the second caliph, the second Mamal HaMakom, and according to this story, he's the one who is standing there at Har Habayis, and he's overseeing this cleanup project. V'chol pam shoisam is galis, and at any point that something was, something was uncovered, right away, he asked the Jews, ala tzachara. Tzachara in Arabic is the sela, is that big rock, meaning the rock that's in the dome of the rock today. And as the letter goes on to say, shehi even hashsiyah. He was asking about the even hashsiyah. So the Mishnah Maseches Yoma says that in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you had a rock, this huge even, and it's called even hashsiyah. Hashsiyah means yisoid, it's a foundation rock. Why is it a foundation rock? So the Rambam says it's foundation rock because it's the Beis Hamikdash, and the Beis Hamikdash is Avodah, and Avodah is the Yesod of the whole world. The world stands due to the merit of the Avodah of Yidden. Chazal gave a different interpretation for Even Hashsiyah. Their interpretation is that it's the foundation of the whole world, meaning it was the foundation, it's the beginning of all the creation, begins with this one Salah, with this Even. So he's asking the elders of the Jewish community in this period in time, who are the people who have information that's reliable? It's always the elders of the community. They're the people who have information. They're the people you trust. He's asking the elders of the Jewish community, we just found a shtickle whatever. Is this it? Is this it? I'm like, no. Hagufa is debris, or it's not the right place, or this is stam bedrock, but it's not the Evan Ashsiyah. Okay. One of the Chachamim, it sounds like it was one of the Jewish Chachamim, marked for him the Gvulas Hamokim, where exactly the Evan Ashsiyah is, Achen Iskalsa, and they dug and they cleaned up until this was revealed. He said, let's build up the wall of the Mikdash, the wall in the area of the Mikdash. The Livnois Kippah ala Tzachar, and to build a dome over this rock, and to plate the dome in gold. So here we're having the story of the building of the Dome of the Rock that Adayoim is on Temple Mount, and he's standing at Kosel Maravi. If you are to look up to the left, you're able to see that dome. Here is the story of the construction of the dome. And what are we being told over here? We're being told in this account that this dome was built where? Over the Evan Ashsiyah, which is what? The Evan Ashsiyah is a Kodesh HaKadoshim, which means, if you want to know, according to this account, or this writer, there was someone who wrote this. According to the person who wrote this, he and his associates believed that if you wanted to know where the Beis Hamikdash stood, it was relatively straightforward, because you know where the Kodesh HaKadoshim is. We also know the orientation, that the Ma'ariv side is the back of the Beis Hamikdash. So you kind of know that, so you enter from the east side of the Beis Hamikdash, so that means all the things that are before the Kodesh HaKadoshim are eastward, and so more or less you're able to map out where the Beis Hamikdash would have been. Why? Because according to this narrative here, the Dome of the Rock is precisely on top of the Evan Ashsiyah, where the Kodesh HaKadoshim was, the Aron, and during the first Beis Hamikdash sat on top of the Evan Ashsiyah. Okay. Now what happens is, what?
The timeline makes sense from when it's written to when the picture was built?
Yeah, more or less, whatever. I don't want to get into other sources, what they say, but more or less it fits. I think if you look online, they say the Dome of the Rock is a little later, but here it doesn't have the year. It doesn't mamish have the year. But I think it's generally said that it's built a few decades later in the 7th century. There's some people say it's not Umar that built it. It's the first caliph before him. I don't remember. I'm not so interested in the specific details and the historicity of Umar versus this guy or what year. What I'm mostly interested in is that there were Jews who said at a certain time, I know where the Kodesh HaKadoshim was. Their voice we're hearing right now. We don't know exactly who they are. We don't know where they live. But if we assume that this was the handwriting of this single page is from the 1000s or 1100s, and obviously it's that time or before that there are Jews who believe this. Now, because it's so interesting, I can't help but continuing over here, even though it's not necessary for our needs. According to this account, a dialogue, a debate, a discussion, a give and take went back and forth between who? Between the local Jews and local Christians. So during the Byzantine period, the Christians controlled everything that went on in Yerushalayim, including whether Jews were allowed to live in the city at all. And they persecuted Jews relentlessly. So now what happens is there's a new sheriff in town. So now the Mitzad Umar, what he wants is that there should be peace in the city. No one wants that there should be people fighting, right? But he wants to allow the Jews to return to Yerushalayim. The Christians aren't happy about it. So there's a debate. He asked the Christians, how many Jews are you going to be okay with? And they said 50 families. He asked the Christians, how many Jews would you tolerate? They said 50 families, according to this account. He asked the Jews, how many families you want? They said 200. And he says, we're going to settle on 70, and everyone agreed. And then he asked, where do you want to live? They said, we want to live in the southern part of Yerushalayim, where again, in the time of the writing of this letter, that's where the Shuk HaYehudim is. Okay, Adayoim, the Jewish quarter in Yerushalayim, is the southern part of Yerushalayim. Why? So he says the reason they asked to live in the southern part of Yerushalayim is because they wanted to be close to the Beis Hamikdash. And that is correct. Har Habayis is in the southern part of Yerushalayim. So they wanted to live next to the Beis Hamikdash. And so then they came from Tveria. So during the Roman and the Byzantine period, much of the Jewish population went north. A lot of the activity of the Tanoim that's going on in Eretz Yisrael, Amoraim is going on in Israel. Where is it? All in the north. Tver is in the north. And here what you're seeing is that after the Arab conquest, 200 families, not 200, what do we say? 70 families come down to live in Yerushalayim. This is another detail that you have in this, again, one-page account that is found in the Cairo Geniza, again published, came to the consciousness of the world for the first time in 1939. Okay, now this idea that the Dome of the Rock is the precise location of the Kodesh HaKadoshim was echoed in later sources as well. We're going to turn now to two famous travelogues. First up is Binyamin of Tadella. So Tadella is a city in Navarre. Navarre today is northeast Spain. At the time it was an independent kingdom, Tadella. Navarre was an independent kingdom. The largest city in Navarre is Tadella. So Binyamin of Tadella, sometime around the year 1165, he traveled to many different places in the east and he wrote a travel log, which was a bestseller. Jews were very interested in reading this because this is the little exposure you can have of what's going on in other places of the world. Otherwise, you're completely cut off. This book saw print relatively early, in 1543 already. This book was printed, and before that, for a number of centuries, it survived as copied manuscripts. So he's describing over here his travels. Umisham, from wherever he's writing, it was 3 parsois. He uses that measurement, 3 parsois to Yerushalayim. And now he describes Yerushalayim. It's a small city. It is a walled city. And it has 3 walls. He says 3 walls. Okay, it's a discussion about the 3 walls. We're not going to get into that. Anoshim Baharbe, a lot of people live in Yerushalayim. Then he says the Arabs who live in Yerushalayim. Now, it's important. He comes in 1165, around that time. He traveled 1165, so I can't tell you exactly what month and what day and what year he came to Eretz Yisrael, but it's in that kufa. This is during the Crusader period, which means the Christians are in control. So if you're out in Cup, we spoke about the Romans, we spoke about the Byzantines, we spoke about the Arabs, and in 1099, the Crusaders took Eretz Yisrael. So you have to halt Cup about who's in control at what point. So Binyamin of Tadella, when he comes to Eretz Yisrael in the 1160s, it's a Crusader kingdom. However, many Arabs are living in the city. So he says that the Arabs refer to all the different groups of people that live here. There's the Jacobites, which is some Christian sect. There's Aramim, which probably means Syrians. Yevonim is Greeks. There's Georgians and Frankush. So Frankush, Arabs refer to anyone who came from Europe as a Frank, which is funny because of other variations of that. But that's how Arabs refer to Europeans, as Franks. So when it says here Franks, it means Europeans. A lot of Europeans are, obviously, because the Crusaders are there. They were all Europeans. Many other people. So it's interesting. You don't have a lot of international cities in the 12th century, but it looks like Yerushalayim is a shtickle international city during that century. A lot of different languages and peoples who are there. Then he describes the economy of the Jews who live there. V'yesham beis hatzviyos. There is a dyeing business that the Jews buy from the king. Okay, so the Crusader king in the 1160s, his name is Amalric. Okay, that's his name. And they buy from him, the kingdom of Jerusalem, they buy from him the right to basically do all the dyeing in Yerushalayim. Dyeing in the sense of making color, introducing color to clothing. And only Jews could do this. He writes that there's 200 Jews who live there. They live next to Migdal David, which is at the edge of the city. Now, Migdal David is actually the opposite of what we learned before. Migdal David is the west of Yerushalayim. But remember, it's a different period. According to the story we saw before, in the 7th century, Jews said, we want the southeast part of Yerushalayim, right next to the Beis Hamikdash. Here we're learning that during the Crusader period, the Jews are living where? Further away in the outskirts, so to speak, of the city, on the western side, next to the building that is known as Migdal David. Now, it's very likely that there's a mistake over here when you say 200 Jews, because we're going to see just a few years later someone saying there's only one Jewish person living in Yerushalayim, and we generally don't want to have a contradiction, 200 families versus one. There's manuscripts of Binyamin of Tadella that say, instead of a Masayim Yehudim, say Reish Yehudim, and some have speculated that maybe the Reish was once a Dalid. So the Dalid turned into the Reish, and the Resh turned into the Messiah. Anyway, bringing it to your attention, you'll decide what you want to do with that. He continues going on and describing what he sees in Yerushalayim. He says there's two buildings here. One is a hospital, a shpital. He refers to a hospital. They say they know exactly where this building is. Okay, and the second Bayis, Habayis Hasheni, is called Tempuli Solomon, the Temple of Shlomo. What is the Temple of Shlomo? The Temple of Shlomo, we know, during the Crusader period, they called what is today the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they call that building Solomon's Temple. Why do they call it Solomon's Temple? Because there were two major buildings on Har Habayis. There was the Dome of the Rock. The Dome of the Rock, the Crusaders called Temple Domini. In Latin, that means Hashem, God's Temple. So if that's God's Temple, we need a name for the other one. So Solomon's Temple, because, Shlomo Melech has a temple, has a Beis Hamikdash as well. So they call this God's Temple, they call this Solomon's Temple. And so this is what he's saying. He's saying there's a house over there, a building over there, called Solomon's Temple. What is it? How is it used? It's the Armoin Sha'asa Shlomo Melech Yisrael. So he understands that the reason it's called that is because Shlomo Melech made this palace. Now today, do we believe that Shlomo Melech made that palace? No, we don't believe that he made it. But that's what he was told then. He was told that this Al-Aqsa Mosque was made by Shlomo Melech as a palace. Now the reason he's thinking of it as a palace is because the Crusader palace was there. That's where the Crusader king, the king of Jerusalem, this guy Almaric, that's where he lived. And he had his knights were all living in a part of this. Again, prior it was a mosque. During the Arab period, it was a mosque. Now it was transferred into a palace where, and he writes, "V'sham choinim haproshim." That's where the knights are dwelling. And then, now, if you're standing at the Kosel Maravi and you look to your right, so that's where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, which is all the way at the southern edge of the Har Habayis. Now, if you're at the southern part of Har Habayis, imagine usually at the Kosel Maravi, now move yourself from the Kosel Maravi and go to the southern wall, not the eastern, not across from the Kosel Maravi, but to the right, go to the southern wall. To the right of that, so the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be right in front of you. To the right of that is an area that was called Solomon's Stables. The reason it was called Solomon's Stables is because the palace was Solomon's building. There were stables over there, and why were there stables? Because the knights were there. A knight needs a horse, right? Can't be a knight without a horse. So, hence Solomon's Stables. Okay, now that area was changed in the last 20 or so years. That area of Solomon's Stables was turned into a mosque. There was a lot of tension and politics about that issue. Okay, he continues and says, Visham, and there, also in Yerushalayim, you have Tempuli Domini. Here's the other building. Here's God's temple. And Hu Haya Makam HaMikdash. This was the place where the Beis Hamikdash was, which is echoing the same idea that we had in the letter about Umar's conquest of Yerushalayim, that this is where the place of the Beis Hamikdash is. Ubala Allah of Umar ben Al-Khattab, same name. This Umar built a kippah gdoila v'yafe ad ma'od. He built a dome, a beautiful and significant large dome. Okay, then he goes on and he says, a very interesting line here, the non-Jews do not bring any tzelem and any tmuna into this building. They come to daven. They only go there to pray. Okay, there's what he says, there's why he's saying it. Why he's saying what he says is very obvious and very intuitive. It's very hard for a Yid to accept the idea that there is literally Avodah Zarah going on in a place you just finished telling me is the place of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Okay? It's more comforting to say and to know that people come there to pray. Maybe they're not of your religion, but there's no Avodah Zarah there. There's no crosses there. There's no pestle there. There's no pictures of this person or that person. As a reader today, it's a little hard. We do know that the Crusaders had that as a church. So if you're going to tell me that there was no icons and there was no crosses and none of that inside, okay, is that factually true? Because it definitely sounds like a very interesting claim. So again, I understand why he's saying it. In terms of the what, I didn't do more research to figure out exactly what was actually going on over there. But what's our main point from this text? If you ask Binyamin of Tadela, do you know where the Beis Hamikdash was? He would say, of course. The Beis Hamikdash was at the site where the Dome of the Rock is built. Okay, and then we get the same idea 10 years later from our next traveler. These are the two very famous medieval Jewish travelers. While Reb Binyamin came from Tedela, which is on the Iberian Peninsula, Reb Sachia came from the Ashkenazi Jewish community. He's known as Reb Sachia of Regensburg. And this is the era of the Balei HaTosfos in the 1100s. Sometime around 1175, he sets out from Germany, and he also makes his rounds. He goes to Bavel, and he goes to Eretz Yisrael, and he didn't write his account. It looks like he's speaking his account, and someone else is writing it. You're able to tell from the way it is written. Okay, so V'halach l'Yerushalayim. Reb Sachia went to Yerushalayim. Ve'ein sham, there's no Jews there. Ella Rebbe Avram Hatzaba. There's Avram the dyer. That's good. He's dying. We like that. Not dying. He's inducing color into clothing. Okay, but so that's good because that is consistent with what we saw before from Reb Binyamin. But again, he's the only Jew who's in town. He pays the king boatloads of money to stay there. We saw that also. Okay, paying the king. The Har Habayis. Well, what's interesting here is we learn about who is Reb Sachia's guide. Reb Sachia's guide in Yerushalayim is Reb Avram. He's the Jew who lives in town. He knows what's what. He's going to show Reb Sachia around. Shows him Har Habayis. Har Habayis is further east from the Har Habayis. Then he describes again what he sees in Yerushalayim. The Heichal Noah Sham. In Yerushalayim, there's a beautiful building, Shabanu Yishmaelim B'mei Kedem, that the Arabs built in earlier times. When? During Arab control of the city. Remember, even in the 1170s, the Crusaders are still in control. It was about 100 years, from 1099 till I think the 1180s or something, when they lost control over Yerushalayim. They remained in other places in Eretz Yisrael, but their control of Yerushalayim remained for around 100 years. Uvo Pritzim. Now he tells us a Maisa. Presumably he heard this from Avram Hatzaba. That you had Pritzim. We'll just say Jews who weren't of the best caliber. Vilshinu lemelech hayishmaelim. That's, I assume that means Jews. And they were malshin to the melech hayishmaelim, to the king. Va'amru, and they said, Zakein echad yesh beinenu. We have one elderly Jew. Remember the Skenim? They're the ones who have all the knowledge. And he's Yedei Makam Heichal V'Azar. And he knows where the Heichal is. He knows, and there's only one. No one else knows. So here we're getting a variation of the Umar story, where in this Umar story, Umar's like, I need to know where the temple was. I need to know, and no one knows. He goes to the Jew, and no one knows. They can't tell him. And then they say, but Malshin says, there's one Yid that he knows. He knows. And so this guy, what was the dachak? Was it words? Was it cajoling? Was it torture? But he showed the place of the Beis Hamikdash. And the narrative continues over here, and the text here is gonna be problematic on some level. Umar liked the Jews. He doesn't mention his name, but we're going to assume it's the same name we saw in other places. And he said, I want to build for you guys a heichal. And he writes to live in this heichal sham on the Har Habayis. The law is followed by on the place where you had the Beis Hamikdash. And only Jews should be able to daven there. And indeed, he built a heichal me'avnei shaish from this wonderful stone, and it's a binyan noah, and it's red and it's green and there's all these wonderful colors. And he built this building. Okay, I'm kind of left hanging. And what, as the guy used to say on the radio, and now you know the rest of the story. What's the rest of the story over here? Like, he wanted to build a building for the Jews, and everyone lived happily ever after. What happened? He goes on to talk about another thing. So, he doesn't say the end of the story. It sounds like, and the plan was aborted, and instead it turned into a mosque. Or not a mosque, but it turned into a Muslim shrine. Okay? So, like, that part is, like, missing from his narrative. And it sounds like there's like a Havamina, like this needs to be a Jewish building at a certain point, but it doesn't become a Jewish point. No clarity on this from this particular text. So we'll have to just live with that ambiguity. But what do we see from this text? We see from this text is a confirmation of the same basic idea. The building that was built there was pointed out by who? By Jews. And the king wanted what? He wanted the place of the Makam HaMikdash. And that's where the building was. So if you put these three texts together, while there's variations and there's differences between them, if you want to walk out with a central idea, the central idea being that the Dome of the Rock sits on top of the Beis Hamikdash in general, but in particular the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Even HaShasiyah, you can do that with these three texts, which, as we said before, that gives you a certain clarity. I'm not going to say 100% clarity, but a certain clarity on roughly where the Beis Hamikdash would have, where the Beis Hamikdash stood. Now, before we continue, it's worth wondering why in this narrative, what's this idea about there's only one Jew? Let's go back to that, the 1630s, and according to this variation of the story, in the earlier variations, all the Skenim knew. And Umar is consulting with all the Skenim, so it means everyone knows. Here it's one Zaken, there's one guy who knows. There's only one person who knows. So what happened? It was being kept. Why didn't he tell everyone? He never told all the Jews, Shabbos by the Kiddush. By the way, I know where the Makam HaMikdash is. No one knows. He's the only one who knows. What happened? It would seem that this story, the thinking behind the story is that Jews wanted to keep the Makam HaMikdash secret. That seems to be the thinking behind the story, that they wanted to keep it secret. And so therefore, there was only one guy who knew, and no one else knew because he never told them. And how did Umar find out? Not by willingly Jews telling him. No, dachaki. So in other words, the theme in this story is Jews don't want to share where the Har Habayis is, which leads to the question, why? Or where the Makam HaMikdash is. Why? Why would Jews be reticent to share where the Makam HaMikdash was? So, I don't know. But maybe you could say the reason is because they didn't want that other people should build other stuff on that location. They didn't want other people should take that location for themselves, because then you would have a different version of Shualim Hilchubai, which you don't want. So therefore, it was like, keep it a secret. Then it'll be a mystery they wouldn't know. Okay. So, if that's what's happening over here, again, this doesn't at all change anything in terms of the larger thing that we emerge from the three texts. But I'll share with you I know this is a little out there. I try not to say things that are a little out there, but I can't hold myself in. So the Rambam, let's talk about the Rambam for a second. The Rambam in Mer Nevuchim in Chelek Gimel has a discussion about a famous problem. What's the problem? The problem is why in Sefer Dvarim, whenever it speaks about the Makam HaMikdash, it says the place God will choose. The place God will choose. Why doesn't it say clearly in Torah where this site is going to be? This is a famous question. There's numerous answers. So the Rambam says three answers. The first thing he says is because we didn't want the Goyim to fight over the location. So if it's not in the Torah, so then there's less knowledge about where it is, I guess. Or there's an element of deniability. You could always say, no, it's not that space. Or at least God didn't say it should be that space. Then he says a variation of the same idea, that if Goyim take control over it, we don't want them to ruin it. By again saying, this is the space, so therefore we can... So no, I don't know if it's the space. It doesn't say clearly in the Torah, maybe it's not. So these are the... Okay, so that's what the Rambam says. He gives a third reason. Hopefully I'll come back to that at the end, of why he thinks the Torah didn't say the Makam HaMikdash. But now we have to remember, the Rambam is in Eretz Yisrael, mamish during this tkufa, when Binyamin of Tadela is there, and when Rabbi Sachar Regensburg is there. I think, what did we say then? It was 1160s, I think we said, that he was in Eretz Yisrael. I think we even said 1165. So it's mamish around this tkufa. Now, Rabbi Sachar hears this Maisa. So Rabbi Sachar heard a story. So where did he hear the story? He heard it from Jews in Israel, or from that what Jews wanted to keep it secret. So the Rambam must have heard that story too. The Jews wanted to keep it secret. So, and why? So I think that it was understood then, because we don't want the Goyim to take control. So does that have any impact on the Rambam's commentary on why the Torah therefore kept it secret? In other words, there was a prevailing story going around during those years and decades in Eretz Yisrael about an attempt to keep it secret. So maybe that leads the Rambam to using that as a biblical interpretation in Mer Nevuchim. Take it or leave it. L'chaim. Okay, now, one could come about this and say, you showed three sources. None of these are poskim. None of them are psak halacha. And you know that when someone paskins halacha, it has a certain tkifus, it has a certain strength. You showed me a traveler, Reb Sachia. He's talking to Avram Atzaba. He's getting his information from this Reb Avram. Who's this Reb Avram? What did the Reb Avram know? And Binyamin Tadela, traveler. And this one page from the Cairo Gniza. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know where he got his information from. But beyond that, you'd say further and say, information is information. Information that becomes psak halacha is a whole other category. Well, you don't have that here. Okay, it's a good time. However, if you accept, and I think we need to accept, if you accept based on what we saw last time, if you accept that during this period in time the Rambam went to Har Habayis, as he says, he davened Har Habayis HaGadol VaHaKadosh Hazeh, and Beis Alikim Nahalach V'Ragash, all those language and the words that he used that we saw in the previous class, Ayin Sham. So if he went up, so al smach what did he go up? So it would have, if you have these three things that are out there, it would be so unreasonable to assume that it was al smach something other than this. So, b'pashtus, we would say that you have these narratives that are out there, and the Rambam relied on those narratives. That the Dome of the Rock is the Makom of the Kiddush HaKadoshim, in which case a person can make cheshbonis not so difficult, and could go up onto Har Habayis, not go to a place where a Tamei Meis is not allowed to be there, could be nizer in Tuma, Yetz Megufa, go to Mikvah, whatever. That's what we said last time. So if that's the case, then suddenly these three accounts do have the power of psak behind them. The psak halacha l'maisa that the Rambam, together with his brother and a father and another man named Yefes, all went on to Har Habayis. And what would the other way of them doing it would be? Like, how else? What else would there be? Like that Ruach HaKodesh, or where they could go? Like, I don't think that's the way we should think about this. I think the most reasonable thing to think about this is that they were working with this information. So suddenly this very information that right now is just travelogue information, that's right now just, I don't know, random people talking, suddenly it actually may have the weight of a psak halacha, at least for the Rambam, as it was for himself. However, as we're going to see, we move through the centuries. Suddenly, the level of the tone changes. And suddenly this Kabbalah of it's 100% the Dome of the Rock, it starts to shake a little bit. And we're going to try to track how that happens and where that happens. Due to the constraints of time, we are going to have to skip our discussion about the Kaftar V'Ferach, and we are going to jump ahead to the conversation, to the writings of Rabbi Avadia Mibar Tanura on this subject. So Rabbi Avadia Bar Tanura lives in the 1400s, the early 1500s. If you enjoy that wine, that blue wine, so it's all thanks to him, right? The Bar Tanura wine. Okay. Anyway, he traveled to Eretz Yisrael in 1488 and wrote a letter back home. And this is essentially, it's a very important document where you learn a lot about Jewish communities in the Middle East. And he writes about Har Habayis. Look what he says. He says, "Beis Hamikdash, in the Beis Hamikdash, now lo yuchal shum Yehudi liikanis. No Jew could enter the Beis Hamikdash." Now, when he says the Beis Hamikdash, what does he mean? So we already had this discussion in the prior class about this. It's very clear from this text, if you read it from beginning to end, when he says Beis Hamikdash, he means Har Habayis. And he's not the only one to use that type of language. Har Habayis, Jews are not allowed to go. This is, okay, let's keep track. Now we're in 1488. 1488 is an Arabic ruler. It's still before the Ottomans came. That's like in the 1500s. But it's the Arabs based out of Cairo. In Egypt, they're in control of Eretz Yisrael. So he says they don't allow Jews onto Har Habayis. Now he says a very interesting line. V'gam ki pa'amim rabbis ratzah yishmaelim lahachnis sham Yehudim charshe eitz v'tzarfim. There have been times when the Arabs have wanted Jews, those who work with wood and people who do the welding, to come up to Har Habayis, lases sham b'charishes eitz v'chol malach, do various construction projects. Nimnoyin ha-Yehudim likanis, the Jews don't go. They don't want to go. Now you say they don't want to go. They don't want to build something that's for another religion. No. Mipnei Tuma. They don't want to go because of the issue of Tuma. Where? To the pashtus of the Lashon is to the whole Har Habayis. Jews do not want to go at all onto the Har Habayis because of Tuma. This is, I think it's the earliest source where you have someone saying Jews don't want to go onto Har Habayis, period, the whole thing, because of the issue of Tuma. Now again, if it's Tuma Yetz Megufay, go to the mikveh and go on Har Habayis. If it's Tumas Meis, there's an issue. But what do you mean? Tumas Meis, you know where the Beis Hamikdash is? So maybe you're seeing over here that in the 1400s there's a certain queasiness of I don't know, maybe we don't know exactly where the Beis Hamikdash is, and so we're Tamei Meis. And so, again, I'm not saying that's 100% Mefurish here, but that's a very reasonable way of reading this. He continues and says, Lo yachalti lamed al buryoi shel davar. I was not able to figure it out entirely. Im nichnasim ha'yishmaelim lefnai v'lefnim v'imai. Do the Arabs actually go into what we consider the Kodesh HaKadoshim or not? Meaning, he knows they go into the Dome of the Rock. That's not difficult for someone even then to figure out. But the question is that Mamish the Kodesh HaKadoshim? We're like, well, there's a Messiah that it is the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and he's going to mention that in a second. But still, you have to kind of really know the measurements to know if the place that they stand, where they actually stand, is that Mamish the Kodesh HaKadoshim. I wasn't able to figure that out. If where people actually stand is the Kodesh HaKadoshim. It will become a little clearer as he moves on. Gam Chakarti, I also investigated. Al Even Shesiya, Shesham Hayar and Munach. Where's the Even Shesiya? V'Rabim Oimrim. Many people say that it's Tachas Kipa Achas Yafa Gavoya, that it's under this dome. Asher Banu HaYishmaelim B'Mikdash, that the Yishmaelim built B'Mikdash. B'Mikdash means on Har Habayis. Uskura B'Secha Kipahi, and it is enclosed within the dome, meaning the rock, there's a little wall around the rock, which is the way it is Ad Hayoim. You can't go in. Now, it doesn't mean you can't go into the dome. Of course, he knows people go into the dome. You can't go like onto the rock. That you can't do because the rock itself is surrounded by a wall. You can't get there. Now, what does it mean, kipa gdolam oid? He's saying it's so big that even there's room both for the rock and for you to be in the building, but still not on the rock. He's trying to make this all make sense. So what you see from here is, he knows people go into the dome. He's like, a lot of people say it's Even HaShesiya. I don't know if where people are standing, if that's a Kodesh HaKadoshim. Okay, fine. So, there's been a lot of debate about this line here. Rabim Oimrim. One side of the debate says, he's not sure. He's not saying it the way the other sources say it, and he's not going to say it the way a later source is going to say it. Definitive. This is it. No. Many people say. What's your opinion, Rebbe Vadia? I don't know. I'm just telling you what many people say. So that's it's a fair argument. Some push back about that and say, no, don't take that too seriously. I'm kind of inclined to actually accept that he's not 100% sure. That's my inclination. He says this is what people say, so he's happy to kind of work with it, but he's not 100% sure. He then goes on and says that on Har Habayis, many kings come and they build, fancy places. Okay, that's not in the Beis Hamikdash, that's in the periphery. And he talks about that there's 12 entrances into the Beis Hamikdash today. That obviously means, when he says Beis Hamikdash, it means Har Habayis, because there are 12 entrances into Har Habayis. So I'm just leaving that line in there to confirm the idea that whenever he says Beis Hamikdash, he means the Har Habayis. So what's interesting in this text is, nothing earth-shattering here is, but there's two things here. And is it an accident that both of them happen together? One thing, many people say, it's not so definitive. And number two, in the exact same text, even when Yidden are given reshus to go to Har Habayis, what are they saying? We don't want to go. Why? Mipnei atuma. Are those two ideas maybe related to each other? That maybe because it's Rabim Oimrim, it's a Messiah, a lot of people say that, but we're not 100% sure, so therefore, the corollary of that is that people are going to say, even if we had permission to go, we're not going to go. So, nothing strong here, nothing definitive here, but maybe here we're starting to see a little bit of a change in the year 1488 from Rebbe Vadia of Bartanura. And that brings us to the next century. So, the Rebbe Vadia Bartanura is from the 1480s. So, sometime in the 1500s, depends when, the Radvaz. So the Radvaz comes from Spain. He then moves, after the expulsion from Spain, he moves to the Middle East. He's in Mitzrayim for many, many years, famously. He's also on Sfas. He's also in Yerushalayim. So he's moving around in these areas. And he has many Sha'as. Reb David ben Zimra. Sha'alta mimeni adiyah chadati. And this is one of the most famous pieces about the Makam HaMikdash and on the question of going up to Har Habayis. You asked the question, is it mutar likanes la'aliyos habnuyos savav leBeis Hamikdash? Is it permitted to go into these raised structures that are built around the Beis Hamikdash? Shein boltois l'soich Hamikdash, they stick out into the Mikdash. Is it permitted to go agabe zizim v'gizu trois, to go on top of balconies? You see people are permitting this, and no one, or people are doing it, and no one is telling them no, so is this permitted? There's a tremendous amount of debate about this Shuvah der Advaz. He's talking about people who are going onto balconies and going onto raised structures that are, in his words, Saviv leBeis Hamikdash, Baltois l'Soich Hamikdash. We already know Beis Hamikdash, Mikdash. These are terms that could almost mean anything. And so the question is, what does he mean? So there's two approaches to this. One approach says as follows, that he's talking about buildings and colonnades. The most straightforward way of understanding this in the first approach is that adjacent to the Kos HaMaravi, but on the other side. So you're standing at the Kos HaMaravi, take your little parachute, jump right over and land 1 foot in front. So what are you landing on? So there's little buildings all along that western wall. There's little buildings, and there's also an area that's like a colony that has a roof with a whole bunch of beams. So one approach is that Yidden are basically going and they're standing on that, which is a little further than the Kos Maravi, not too much further, but it's a little further, and they're standing on that. Why? Because they want to see Har Habayis. They want to see what's going on. And there's, in this interpretation, there's a rabbi who's saying, hey, that's not mutter, that's not permitted, you're on Har Habayis, it's a problem. And he's turning to the Advaz to get a psaktin. Okay, then there's another interpretation. Another interpretation about this question is that if you were to go on Har Habayis, on Har Habayis itself, there's an elevated platform where the Dome of the Rock is. And if you're already on Har Habayis, you still need to go up onto steps to get onto that elevated platform where you have the Dome of the Rock and some other small structures. And at the periphery of that elevated platform, there's some stuff going on. And the other reading is that Jews were going onto Har Habayis, up those steps to the raised platform, and at the periphery of that platform, standing on buildings, aliyahs, whatever. Okay, so this is a very nuanced and debated issue. I go with the first approach. And that's without being an expert in this matter at all. But the reason I'm going with the first approach is very simple. We know that during this period of time, it was very, very strict. Yidden were not allowed onto Har Habayis. And we see this affirmed and reaffirmed in Jewish sources and non-Jewish sources. So for there to be a shaila about Jews who are going onto Har Habayis and going up the steps and they're on the periphery in those buildings over there, very, very shver. Makes more sense that they just, they didn't go mamish onto Har Habayis. They went into a house and they climbed from one place to the next, and now they're on the right in the beginning. So that makes a little more sense to me. So I'm going to go with this first approach, but I'm letting you know this is something that's widely debated. Either way, what happens is that the Radvaz, in his answer, is going to affirm in very strong terms the assumption we saw from those earlier sources. The Dome of the Rock is the Makam of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Look what he says. Hadavar Barer, it is absolutely certain. Shetachas Hakipa Sham Even Hashsia Bali Safek. There is no doubt in my mind that under this dome is where you have the Even Hashsia, which they call the Al Skara, which is that word for the Sela, for the Even, for the rock. Now, when he says this with such certain terms, and we know there's someone who asked the question, we don't. What's motivating the person asking the question? I'm going to guess. The person asking the question was actually not sure. And was actually not sure where the Makam HaMikdash was, and that was probably motivating the question that Amacha is needed, which is why he's so sure that absolutely no, don't worry about it. Because Even Hashia is under the Dome of the Rock. And that's where the Aron was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Therefore, anyone who goes, say if he has he maps out the whole Har Habayis, and really need to do this with pictures. What are we going to do without pictures? He says like this. Therefore, anyone who goes onto these elevated places on the western side of Har Habayis, or if you're going to the gates, the gates that enter into Har Habayis, so you're going from the western side, so you need to do math, and you need to be mishar, that from the dome to where you're standing, there needs to be 11 amas. Okay, 11 amas. Amas from here to here, 11 times that is not so much. You need to just make sure you have 11 amas. What's the cheshbon of 11 amas? Because he assumes that that's roughly the area of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, so now you need to add another 11 amas for the area of the Azara. On the western side, there would have been 11 amas from the wall of the Kodesh HaKadoshim till the wall of the Azara. That's where a Tamei Meis is not allowed to be. So just make sure you're 11 amas away from the from the dome and from the wall of the dome, and you are good. And then he goes on to say that I went to all of the gates that enter Har Habayis, because again I'm going with that interpretation. So all of the gates to enter Har Habayis, and the closest one, so that's the one we need to focus on, the one that's closest to the dome is the gate that is to the left of Bab al-Katanim. Okay, Bab al-Katanim. Bab in Arabic, similar to in Aramaic, Bava. What's Bava? A gate. Shar. Bava Metzia. Baba Kama. Baba Basa. So Bab is a gate. Bab al-Katanim. There is a cotton shuk that is, if you're standing at the Koisel Maravi and you're facing the wall, to your left there is a shuk that an Arab shuk that has a roof over it, so it's covered with a roof, and it runs from west toward east, which means it's going toward Har Habayis, and it has a gate that takes you into Har Habayis. So it's the cotton shuk, and he says over there that the closest door, the closest area where you could stand and be close to the Dome of the Rock is to the left of Bab al-Katin. The problem with this is that it isn't to the left. There's a door that's a little to the right. So a lot of people have struggled with that. Either way. Okay. Then he says, so you need to be really careful in that area. And then he says, I heard that there were some Chachamim who didn't even want to go into the entire shuk of Al-Katanin. But he says, that's a Chumr Yisera. Because I did the math, and remember, you only need to worry about 11 Amas, and that shuk is beyond 11 Amas from where the Dome of the Rock is, so that's a crazy Chumrah to not go there. Okay, now we need to ask ourselves, why do they have the Chumrah not to go there? It could be 100 things. It really could be 100 things, but one of the things that should be on the list is, I don't know where Har Habayis is. I don't know where the Makam HaMikdash is. I have no clue, so maybe they decided not to go into that shuk. Okay, he thinks that's ridiculous because you only need to worry about, because once you take that the Even HaShtiyah is under the Dome of the Rock and you make your cheshbon of 11 Amis, the whole shuk is kosher, is not a problem. And he says like this, so here's the general rule. The houses and structures that are to the north part of Har Habayis and to the east of Har Habayis, there's no problem whatsoever. Mutter to go in there because I know for sure you're far away, you're distant enough. If they move, toward the inside, then he says then you need to do a measurement. The ones on the southern and western side, you need to do measurements. So basically he's saying is there are areas you need to measure, areas you don't need to measure. But again, what's his working principle? His working principle is the one that we saw in the earlier sources, that the Even HaShtiyah is, the Dome of the Rock is the Makam of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and so that pretty much guides his halachic guidance over here. You pull out your 11 Amma measuring stick, and basically then you could do theoretically whatever you want. And he says, people who know how to estimate, it's not like they were given a shus to actually measure. So how are you Mashar? He says, the people who know, they told me there's actually no entry into Har Habayis and no building on the periphery that's not far enough away. Meaning, everything's good. Everything's okay. Everything's far enough away, and so therefore, and this he says, and so therefore you don't even need to worry. Earlier in the tshuva he's like, there are areas you don't need to worry, and then there's areas you need to measure. And then at the end, it almost looks like he added that line at a later point. He says, and now I learned new information, that everything is fine, and you don't need to worry about it, and therefore you could mamish go up to any one of the gates going into Har Habayis. They wouldn't let you pass it, but you go all the way up to the gate, not a problem, and all of those structures that are on the periphery of Har Habayis, you want to go onto them, you're more than 11 amas away, and you're fine. So this tshuva of the Radvaz is interesting. On the one hand, you have over here that same certainty that we seem to suggest existed earlier. And here he's definitely using halacha l'maisa, without the knetch that I made before. Here it's very clear, it's a tshuva halacha l'maisa. Now again, Jews weren't able to go into Har Habayis, but it looks like it was a question of going to all those gates and going to that area in the periphery where they're able to go. And he's mater it, halacha l'maisa, he doesn't have a problem with it. Why? Because Even HaShtiyah is the Dome of the Rock. That is his perspective. At the same time, just like I showed that in the 1480s, in the text from Bartanura, I showed a hint of something else. I think you already see here also hints of something else. Number one, we saw the Jews who aren't going into that shuk, that cotton shuk, the whole thing. So number one, you see that. And number two is the question itself. Is the person who saying, how are you talking no one made a macha? Why does he want a macha? So I can't say definitively, but it's very possible that he wants hamacha because he actually is not willing to accept it, which is why the Radvaz is coming and saying so strongly that it is. And so, if I'm right, then maybe as much as in this tshuva you have a psak that we know and don't worry, at the same time we also may have echoes of people who are not certain and who don't know. Okay, let's move forward and let's move into the next century. Let's move into the 17th century when we have the Shalah. And here you're going to see for the first time it bursting out in the open, someone saying from afar, to be sure, not someone in Eretz Yisrael, someone from afar saying, oh my God, we have no clue. Okay? And then it's going to be interesting to see how the Shalah responds. So what happens is like this. The Shalah is a European, he's a Rav in numerous places in Central Europe, and then sometime around the year 1620, Rabbi Shai Levi Horowitz goes to Eretz Yisrael, and the last decade of his life, more or less, he lives in Eretz Yisrael. And a letter was printed. I don't remember when this letter came out. I think it was relatively recently, if I recall correctly. Of him responding, yeah, it was very, very recently. In the last 20 years, this letter was found in a manuscript in Germany. He writes a letter to Reb Shmuel, the Av Bezdin of Premisla. Now, this Reb Shmuel, the Av Bezdin of Premisla, we already once discussed him at great length around this table. And that is because we learned of a case of a murder that happened in the town of Premisla. And the shaila was, should they get the murderer off the hook, save him from the Polish authorities, or should they allow the Polish authorities to execute him? And Reb Shmuel had this case, and he sent a shaila to Maharam Lublin, the mayor of Lublin, and they had a whole debate about the death penalty on this issue of fasting and tshuva. So it's the same Reb Shmuel who writes a letter to the Shalah. And we learn about what this letter from the Shalah is from Shalah's response. Let's read Shalah's response. You are surprised that I live in Yerushalayim? What's wrong with living in Yerushalayim? Because of the Kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash, which is still relevant today. And Reb Shmuel continues and says, we don't know where the Mikdash is. And therefore, Kol Yerushalayim is Safek Kares. Gant Yerushalayim is a Safek Kares, because you never know. If you're at the Machne Yehuda market, it's very possible the Beis Hamikdash was there. So Gant Yerushalayim is off the table. And that's why the greats did not live in Yerushalayim. So I don't think, I've never seen anything definitively on why, of the Arizal or his student saying why I didn't live in Yerushalayim, but he lives in Tzfas. But you could imagine people wondered, why would you live in Tzfas and not Yerushalayim? Yerushalayim is the best place to live. And I'm wondering if a theory develops of there must have been some spiritual reason, and maybe the spiritual reason is this, because we don't know the Makom HaMikdash. Anyway, this is an extreme version of the doubt about Makom HaMikdash. I'm not saying that this is something a person needs to rely on. That's not my concern. My concern is when Jews consider themselves certain and when not. And there's no way he would have been the only one to have felt this way. If Reb Shmuel felt this way, it means other Jews felt this way. So therefore, if you're looking for Jews saying, we have no clue where the Beis HaMikdash was, I think we have here now evidence that sometime in the 1620s, there were Jews who felt this way, which turned into a shaila on the Shalah. How dare you? It wasn't a stammer thing. It was like, how dare you? How dare you live in Yerushalayim? And for the Shalah, you should know, there never was a doubt about the place of the Beis HaMikdash. Just like there's no doubt that there was a Beis HaMikdash and that there will be a Beis HaMikdash, so too there is no doubt about the place of the Beis HaMikdash. It was not lost from our eyes even for a second. Even though Yerushalayim went from one government to another, nonetheless, the tradition and knowledge did not stop. Therefore, in fact, Hashem gave us the Kos Ma'aravi, and leaving it as a vestige of the Beis HaMikdash complex, because that is a way of knowing where the Beis HaMikdash was. And in addition to that, we have Har Habayis, and we know where Har Habayis is. And in addition to that, we know where Har Hazeisim is, otherwise known as Har HaMishcha. And Emek Yoy Shafat, that's the valley between Har Habayis and Har Hazeisim. And Nachal Kidron and Mea Shiloach. We know where all this stuff is. Hakol Mesumon Ubar Leinai. There's no doubt about where the Beis HaMikdash and the Kosel Hamaravi where they are. Rak ein anachnu yoidim neged eiz hamakom halach hamikdash. However, we don't know neged eiz hamakom. I'm going to translate this as, we don't know where exactly on Har Habayis the Beis Hamikdash stood. That's how there are other people who don't want to read it this way, but that's how I'm reading it. And others do as well. I think that's the most reasonable way of reading this. We don't know where, we only have the Kosel Maravi. And so therefore, I don't know where exactly the Beis Hamikdash, where the Beis Hamikdash was. Now, so what's interesting is, his response pushes back hard on Reb Shmuel. You say we have no clue. No, we know exactly. But he only is arguing that we know generally where it was, that it was on Har Habayis. He does not make the case here. And in fact, he does not say, and there's the Dome of the Rock, and that's the place. He doesn't say that. Okay? But not only doesn't say that, he adds the words, we don't know, neged eiz hamakom halach hamikdash. Which, the most simple reading of those words is, on Har Habayis he has no clue. And which explains why he doesn't bring the Dome of the Rock. He doesn't bring the Dome of the Rock because he has no clue. If it's the Dome of the Rock, if it's not the Dome of the Rock, if it's to the right, if it's to the left, he doesn't know. He doesn't know, but he knows it's somewhere on there, so you can live in Yerushalayim, not a problem. Okay, so you can add this to the developing story of Jews not knowing. Well, this is a developing story, and here you see an extreme expression of the development. Even in the pushback, you still see an element of uncertainty. That, again, would put that together with a minig of Jews 200 years earlier in the 1480s, where say, we're not going at all. We're not going at all. Or where Bartanura said, Rabim Oimrim, where he doesn't get behind it and he doesn't push it. Or in the 1500s, where the Radvaz has someone who's saying, I don't know, which is why it probably turns into the question. And why Jews aren't going into this market, the cotton market. Even as Radvaz pushes back. Shalah seems not to accept. It seems, again, he doesn't address the Radvaz, he doesn't talk about the Radvaz, but he seems not to accept that. And so therefore, I do think that we could add the Shalah to the narrative of doubt, both because of the question and even because of what he says. Now he goes on, the Shalah, and in the next paragraph he says, when I came here, boy, it's getting late. He says, when I came here, I saw that the Chachamim told me, the rabbis told me, that one of the bathhouses is a suffix. Okay, so we know a lot about the bathhouses in Yerushalayim. It's in that strip, in that cotton market, there was a bathhouse over there. And again, this is similar. We know there are Radvaz, there were Jews who were saying things about that market. And here some people were saying there's a problem with merchatz in Yerushalayim that's in that market. Maybe the Beis Hamikdash got there. So if the Beis Hamikdash is popping out and it's like past the, again, what does he mean Beis Hamikdash? Does it mean Beis Hamikdash? Does it mean Har Habayis? It's hard to know. But this fits the narrative of doubt. We're not entirely sure. And what does he do? He right away says, he bans it. He's a Rav, he paskins, you're not allowed to go there. We came to Yerushalayim to be holier. So we have to make our chaka and our chaka of our chaka, even if it's 1,000 sveikas. And so therefore he banned this merchatz. Okay. You said, why didn't the great rabbis live in Yerushalayim? He says, that's not the reason. The reason they didn't live in Yerushalayim is because Tzfas used to be a big city. And during the time of the Beis Yosef, meaning in the 1500s, you had 10,000 balabatim, there were chachamim, nevoinim, they lived over there. And you had rich people who were there. Yerushalayim was destroyed, very few citizens, and they were all very poor. So therefore, everyone lived in Tzfas. And at the same time, the people from Tzfas, they got on the bus, and they would come down to Yerushalayim, they took Eged, and they came and they would come to Yerushalayim. According to you, they should have never come. But they came to Yerushalayim for a visit. And then he says, and there were Doilim who lived in Yerushalayim. In the time of the Beis Yosef, we had Reb Levi ibn Chabib. We spoke about him when we did the classes on Smicha. He was Yerushalayim. So he was taka. Most of the Rabbanim lived in Tzfas, but he was in Yerushalayim. So you see, this idea that you can't live in Yerushalayim is off the table. So it's fascinating that there's a thought in Torah that a Yid can't live in Yerushalayim. No. Okay, then he says another thing. The truth is, some Rabbanim didn't like Amaratzim in Yerushalayim because they could end up in marketplaces and go in the wrong place, and maybe they're going to get close to the Gvul HaMikdash. Okay, so here again you see, he's living in an area of epis doubt. There is a chashash, there is a problem that you could stray, and again, Jews can't get onto Har Habayis. So he's talking about not going on Har Habayis, but still being on Har Habayis. Add this to the element of doubt that is in the air at that time. Why did Arizal live in Yerushalayim? So the reason he said before about, it wasn't a good place for Gashmi is not enough. So he says, number one, there were more Talmidei Chachamim in Tzfat. He needed to be with Talmidei Chachamim. And number two, he had Ruach HaKodesh. He knew he needed to be buried, that he needed to be buried in Tzfat. Okay. So I think that we're going to actually stop here. There's tons of sources on this subject, but I think we got enough to be able to see what. What did we see? What we saw is that in the period of the Rishonim, in the 1100s, a little before as well, we saw that there was an assumption, Kodesh HaKadoshim is the Dome of the Rock, in which case you could figure out more or less where the Beis Hamikdash was. That would explain the Rambam's behavior, and that also gives you the Radvaz in the 1500s still wants to live by that. He still wants to live by that. You need your 11 Amma marker, and you're good to go. That's pretty much, that was that Mahalach. But already starting with, in the 1400s, from Avadia Bar Tanura, we see hints of doubt, hints of Chumrah. To be clear, no one at any point in any of these sources says, by the way, the Beis Hamikdash was somewhere else. No one offers an alternative location. And I'm saying that some have suggested that it's mashma from this or that. I don't want mashmas. There's no one who says clearly in any of these centuries the Beis Hamikdash is somewhere else. But at the same time, there are hints of doubt that we've discussed, and that kept on building over the years until you reached this place where by the time we come to Montefiore in the 1800s, when he went up, it was like, what do you mean? That's Asr v'Tachlis Yisra, and no one even kind of disagrees with that. So now you kind of like see the backstory of how that slowly developed. Now what happened is in years later, there were people, meaning in the 1900s. In the 20th century, then you had other people who started suggesting alternative models. And so there are people, right? Rabbi Goren suggested an alternative model where the Mizbeach is the Evan HaShiyah. So then that changes your calculation of how things go. And there are others who place the Beis Hamikdash further south on Har Habayis. So when people say that there's a machlokas of the Makam HaMikdash, it can mean one of two things. Either they mean the modern discussion of the alternative theories of where the Beis Hamikdash would have been, or they may mean that there's just some sources indicate elements of doubt, as we kind of saw today. Okay, now I want to conclude with the Moreh Nevuchim. We spoke before about the Moreh Nevuchim. The Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam writes about why the Makam HaMikdash is not specified clearly in Sefer Devarim. And it always says, Asher Yivchar, this is the place God's going to choose. And he gave three answers. His first two answers were very similar, that it was basically to protect the site. Protect the site from non-Jews trying to claim it in war, or once they already have it, from non-Jews who are desecrating the site. And so that was the idea of keeping it secret in Torah Shabbat. But then, and with this we conclude, he says his third reason. What's his third reason? And he says on this, again he wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, but in the Hebrew translation that I was using, it says, V'hi ha'chazaka shabam. This is the strongest reason. It says if in the times of the Midbar, there would have been, in Sefer Dvarim, Moshe Rabbeinu tells all the Yidden where the Beis Hamikdash is going to be, what would have happened? You would have had another Maisa of Koirach. What was the Maisa with Koirach? Hey, we want to be Koyanim, right? So you would have had, hey, it's not fair, the Beis Hamikdash is by your Shevet, and why does this Shevet get it? And it would have been a machlokes by Yidden. So the Rambam says that's the strongest reason why basically Moshe Rabbeinu just said where Hashem's going to choose. Where, I don't know, everyone fantasized that it's going to be by them. And this is his reason, HaChazaka Shabam. So what's interesting, HaChazaka Shabam is the threat from non-Jews, he gives it as a reason. But what is his real reason? HaChazaka Shabam is the internal threat, the internal fighting amongst Jews. That is the more important reason for why it doesn't say it over there. So maybe also when it comes b'chlal to the issue of Eretz Yisrael and to the Makam HaMikdash v'Hamastayif, maybe the same idea applies, that though there's constantly threats from the outside, but HaChazaka Shabam, the strongest thing that we need to be concerned about is not what others are doing to us, but what we're doing with ourselves. Good.